The grand ballroom fell silent the moment I stepped through the towering glass doors. Every head turned, every whispered conversation died mid-sentence, and even the string quartet seemed to lose their rhythm for just a heartbeat. There I stood, draped in a flowing emerald gown that caught the light like liquid gold. My hair swept back in an elegant crown of braids interwoven with tiny diamonds that sparkled with each subtle movement of my head. Behind me, through those same glass doors, a pearl-white limousine sat gleaming under the entrance lights, its driver standing at attention like a palace guard. But it wasn't the car or the dress that made Marcus Wellington freeze at the altar, his new bride's hand suddenly feeling clammy in his grip. It was the 3 children who walked in behind me, dressed in matching cream-coloured suits and a dress, their little faces mirror images of features he knew all too well. The boy on the left had his exact nose, the girl in the middle had his mother's eyes, and the youngest boy carried that distinctive Wellington chin that had been in his family for generations. I didn't rush. I didn't stumble or hesitate or show even a flicker of the pain he'd expected to see painted across my face when he'd sent that wedding invitation 3 weeks ago. I walked like royalty, returning to reclaim a kingdom, my spine straight, my head held high, and those 3 beautiful children gliding beside me with the kind of poise that only comes from being raised by someone who refused to let bitterness poison their spirit. I could feel Marcus's throat tighten, could sense the eyes of his 500 guests shifting between him and me, the woman he'd thrown away like yesterday's newspaper, the woman he'd called worthless and barren during our divorce proceedings just 3 years ago. His bride, Vanessa, squeezed his hand harder, her perfectly painted smile cracking just slightly at the edges, as she watched me make my way toward the reserved seating area where, ironically, Marcus had specifically requested I be placed in the back row near the kitchen doors. But I wasn't heading to the back. I walked straight down the center aisle, my children's small hands clasped in mine, until I reached the 3rd row, where an elderly woman in purple stood up with tears streaming down her face. Marcus's mother pulled me into an embrace so tight, so full of regret and longing that several guests gasped audibly. The old woman kissed each of the children on their foreheads, whispering something that made them giggle, before gesturing for us to sit beside her in seats that were supposed to be occupied by Marcus's distant cousins. The moment stretched like taffy, sweet and uncomfortable as Marcus stood frozen at the altar, unable to continue the ceremony, unable to look away from me, the woman who was supposed to arrive broken and humiliated. He had imagined this differently, I knew. In his mind, I would show up alone, perhaps in a borrowed dress, my eyes red from crying, my shoulders slumped in defeat. He'd pictured me sitting in the back, watching him marry a woman 20 years younger, a woman with a trust fund and social media influence, a woman who represented everything I could never be. The invitation had been his final act of cruelty, his way of proving that he'd won, that leaving me had been the right choice, that I was nothing without his name and his money. But the woman sitting in that 3rd row, whispering something to his mother that made the old lady laugh through her tears, didn't look defeated. I looked like victory itself, wrapped in expensive fabric and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from surviving hell and choosing to bloom in the ashes. And my children, those impossible, beautiful children who shouldn't exist, according to every fertility specialist Marcus had forced me to see during our marriage, sat swinging their little legs and looking around the ballroom with wide-eyed wonder. I could feel Vanessa tug Marcus's sleeve, heard the pastor clear his throat pointedly, sensed the restless shuffling of guests who were beginning to pull out their phones to capture this unexpected drama. Marcus needed to continue the ceremony, needed to push forward and prove that my presence meant nothing to him, that I was just another face in the crowd. But his voice wouldn't come. His feet wouldn't move. Because in that moment, watching his mother hold one of my children on her lap while whispering secrets into a tiny ear, Marcus Wellington realized with crushing certainty that he'd made a mistake so catastrophic, so irreversible, that all the money in his offshore accounts couldn't buy back what he'd lost. My name is Rachel Thompson, though I used to be Rachel Wellington. And this is the story of how I survived the unsurvivable and returned not for revenge, but for something far more powerful. This is the story of how a love that once burned bright enough to light up the darkest nights turned to ash and spite, and how I rose from those ashes stronger than anyone, including myself, ever imagined possible. The story begins 3 years and 7 months earlier on a Tuesday that started like any other, but ended with words that would change everything. That Tuesday morning, I woke up in our king-sized bed alone, as I had for the past 6 months, Marcus's side cold and undisturbed. I prepared his favourite breakfast, eggs with peppers and onions, toast with honey butter, fresh orange juice squeezed by hand, just the way his mother had taught me during our first year of marriage. I laid out his favourite tie, the navy blue one with tiny silver threads, and I practised in the mirror what I would say when he came home that evening. The doctor had called the day before with news that seemed impossible after 5 years of negative tests, after procedures that left my body aching and my hope diminished, after specialists who'd shaken their heads and suggested we consider other options. But Dr. Chen's voice had been warm and certain on the phone, congratulating me, telling me that sometimes miracles happened when you least expected them, that my blood work showed not just one, but possibly multiple heartbeats. I had cried in the clinic bathroom for 20 minutes, my hands pressed against my still flat stomach, whispering promises to the tiny lives beginning inside me. I had imagined Marcus's face when I told him, imagined him picking me up and spinning me around like he used to do when we first got married, back when his laugh came easily and his eyes still held warmth when they looked at me. That evening, Marcus came home at 11:30, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't the brand I wore. He didn't notice the dinner I'd kept warm in the oven, didn't see the small wrapped box I'd placed on his desk, didn't register the hope shining in my eyes as he loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. I stood in the doorway of his study, my heart hammering against my ribs, the pregnancy test hidden in my sweater pocket like a talisman. I opened my mouth to share the news that would change everything, but Marcus spoke first, his words sharp and final as a judge's gavel. He wanted a divorce. He'd met someone else, someone younger, someone who didn't carry the weight of failure in her eyes every time she looked at him. Vanessa was everything I wasn't, he said, his voice cold and clinical, as if he were discussing a business merger rather than dismantling 8 years of marriage. She was successful in her own right. She didn't need him to complete her. And most importantly, she wasn't broken. That word, broken, hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and the words from my throat. I stumbled backward, my hand instinctively moving to protect my stomach, to shield the precious secret growing there from his cruelty. But Marcus didn't notice my gesture, didn't see the way colour drained from my face, or how my knees threatened to buckle. He continued talking, laying out the terms of our separation with the same efficiency he used in board meetings, explaining that his lawyers had already drawn up papers, that I'd be provided for adequately but not extravagantly, that he expected this to be handled quietly, without drama or public spectacle. I wanted to scream, to throw the pregnancy test at his head, to force him to see what he was walking away from. But something stopped me, some instinct for self-preservation that whispered warnings in my ear. If Marcus didn't want me when he thought I was barren, what would he do with the knowledge that I carried his children? Would he fight for custody out of spite? Would he use his money and power to take them from me? Or worse, would he pressure me to terminate the pregnancy, to erase this miracle before it had a chance to bloom? So I stayed silent, nodded numbly, as Marcus handed me a folder full of legal documents, walked like a ghost through the house we'd built together, gathering my things while he watched with impatient eyes. I took only what fit in 2 suitcases, leaving behind the expensive jewellery he'd bought me, the designer clothes that hung in my closet, the life I'd carefully constructed as Mrs. Marcus Wellington. My wedding ring I left on the bathroom counter, next to the pregnancy test I'd been too afraid to show him, a small act of defiance that he probably never even noticed. That night, I checked into a budget motel on the edge of town, paying with the little cash I had in my purse, and I cried until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat was raw. But when dawn broke through the thin motel curtains, something shifted inside me. I placed my hand on my stomach and made a promise to the lives growing there, a vow that I would survive this, that I would build something beautiful from these ashes, that Marcus Wellington's rejection would not define me or my children. I had no idea then that this promise would lead me on a journey that would transform not just my bank account, but my entire understanding of my own strength and worth. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal, Marcus's team of lawyers descending on me like vultures, picking apart every aspect of our marriage, painting me as a dependent housewife who'd contributed nothing to Marcus's success. They offered me a settlement that seemed generous on paper but was actually pocket change compared to Marcus's wealth, a one-time payment of $200,000 and nothing more. No alimony, no stake in his company, no acknowledgement of the years I had spent supporting his career, hosting his business dinners, playing the perfect wife while he climbed the corporate ladder. My court-appointed lawyer advised me to fight for more, to demand what I deserved, but I signed the papers without argument, desperate to escape before my pregnancy became visible, before Marcus could use my children as leverage or weapons. I took that money and disappeared, moving 3 states away to a small coastal town where nobody knew my name or my story, where I could rebuild in anonymity and peace. The town was called Seaside Haven, a quiet place where the ocean met the sky in endless blue horizons, where people minded their own business and welcomed newcomers without prying into their pasts. The first year was the hardest time of my life. I rented a tiny apartment above a bookstore, stretching every dollar until it screamed, working remotely as a freelance graphic designer while my body swelled with new life. I went to prenatal appointments alone, assembled 3 cribs by myself using YouTube videos and determination, whispered bedtime stories to my growing belly about strength and resilience and the power of starting over. When the triplets arrived on a stormy October night, each one smaller than expected, but fierce and fighting, I held them and wept with a joy so profound it erased months of pain. I named them carefully, Michael, Maya, and Matthew, names that meant strength and gift and blessing. They were mine completely, untouched by Marcus's rejection, pure and perfect, and worth every sacrifice I'd made to protect them. For 2 years, I poured everything into my children and my work, building a client base that appreciated my talent, saving every spare penny, dreaming of bigger things. I started designing logos for small businesses, then websites, then complete brand identities for startups that couldn't afford big agencies but had vision and determination to succeed. One of those startups belonged to a woman named Patricia Chen, a tech entrepreneur who saw something special in my work, something that went beyond technical skill into the realm of true artistry. Patricia hired me to design the complete visual identity for her new app, a platform connecting freelance professionals with clients in emerging markets across Africa and Southeast Asia. The project was challenging, requiring me to research cultural symbols and color meanings to create something that felt both modern and rooted in tradition, global yet respectful of local contexts. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me, working late into the night after the triplets were asleep, filling notebooks with sketches and ideas, pushing myself to create something extraordinary. When I presented the final designs to Patricia, she stared at the screen in silence for so long that my heart began to sink. Then Patricia looked up with tears in her eyes and said 5 words that would change my life completely and forever. I want you as partner. I sat there stunned, unable to process what I was hearing, wondering if exhaustion had finally caught up with me and I was hallucinating. Patricia explained that she'd been searching for someone who understood the vision behind her company, someone who could translate complex ideas into visual language that transcended barriers of geography and culture. She'd been prepared to offer me a generous contract for the design work, but what she really wanted was to bring me on board as co-founder and chief creative officer, offering me a 20% stake in the company in exchange for my continued creative leadership. I was stunned into silence, my mind racing through the implications, the risks, the possibilities. 20% of a startup meant nothing if the company failed, but Patricia's business plan was solid, her connections impressive, her track record of success in previous ventures reassuring. More than that, I felt in my bones that this was the opportunity I'd been preparing for, the chance to build something meaningful, to prove that Marcus had been catastrophically wrong about my worth. I accepted Patricia's offer that same day, shaking hands across a coffee shop table while the triplets coloured in their activity books, completely unaware that their mother had just planted seeds that would grow into a fortune beyond imagination. The app, which we called Bridgeworks, launched 6 months later to modest fanfare, attracting a few thousand users in its first weeks, enough to keep the servers running but not enough to call it a success. I continued my freelance work to pay the bills, pouring my Bridgeworks earnings back into the company, designing marketing materials and user interface improvements, working 18-hour days fueled by coffee and determination. Patricia handled the business development and investor relations, leveraging her network to secure meetings with venture capital firms, while I made sure that every pixel of our platform was perfect, that every user interaction felt intuitive and welcoming. Slowly, gradually, our user base began to grow in ways that excited us. A popular blogger in Lagos wrote about how Bridgeworks had connected her with a web developer in Manila who'd built her site for a fraction of what local agencies quoted. A journalist in Nairobi used the platform to find a translator for his book, praising its ease of use and cultural sensitivity. Word spread through online communities and professional networks, and suddenly, Bridgeworks was adding thousands of new users every week, then every day, then every hour. Within 18 months of launch, Bridgeworks had become the fastest-growing freelance platform in emerging markets, valued at $50 million in our Series A funding round. My 20% stake, once a gamble that kept me awake at night with worry, was now worth $10 million on paper, though I hadn't sold a single share. Patricia wanted to expand aggressively, to capture market share before competitors could establish themselves, and I agreed, both of us driven by a vision of creating economic opportunities for talented people who'd been overlooked by traditional platforms. We hired carefully, building a team that reflected the diversity of our user base, people who understood what it meant to fight for recognition, to build something from nothing. My role expanded beyond design into overall brand strategy and user experience. My insights shaping everything from customer service protocols to the tone of our marketing campaigns. I discovered that I had a gift for understanding what people needed before they knew they needed it, for creating experiences that felt personal and empowering rather than transactional and cold. It was as if every hardship I'd faced had been preparing me for this moment, teaching me empathy and resilience that translated into business success. The triplets were 3 years old when Bridgeworks was acquired by a major tech conglomerate for $320 million, a deal that made headlines in business publications and transformed me from a comfortable professional into a genuinely wealthy woman. My share of the acquisition, after taxes and legal fees, came to just over $50 million, an amount so staggering that I had to read the bank statement 3 times before my brain could process the numbers. But money, I discovered, couldn't erase the scars Marcus had left on my soul, couldn't silence the voice in my head that sometimes whispered that I was broken, worthless, unlovable. I'd built an empire, yes, but I'd built it alone, without a partner to share the victories or comfort me through the failures. The triplets were my joy and my purpose, But sometimes late at night, after they were asleep and the house was quiet, I felt the weight of my loneliness pressing down on my chest like a stone. I'd dated occasionally, met men who were interested and kind, but none of them had been able to break through the walls I'd built around my heart to protect myself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. Then, 3 weeks before Marcus's wedding, the invitation arrived in my mailbox, forwarded from my old address through a chain of mail services until it finally found me in my new life. I stared at the thick cream-coloured envelope with my name written in elegant calligraphy, felt my hands begin to tremble as I opened it and read the formal text inviting me to witness the marriage of Marcus Wellington to Vanessa Price. At first, I felt only confusion washing over me. Why would Marcus invite me to his wedding? We hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalised, hadn't exchanged so much as a text message in 3 years. Then understanding dawned, cold and sharp as a knife between my ribs. This wasn't an invitation at all. It was a declaration of victory, a final twist of the knife, Marcus's way of showing me that he'd moved on to bigger and better things, while I remained stuck in the past he'd discarded. He wanted me to see him happy, successful, beloved, everything he believed I could never be or provide. He wanted me to witness his triumph and my defeat, to sit in that audience and remember every cruel word he'd spoken during our divorce, every accusation of inadequacy, every suggestion that I was the problem, the broken piece in an otherwise perfect life. My first instinct was to throw the invitation in the trash and forget it ever existed, to protect myself and my children from Marcus's toxicity. But as I sat there holding that expensive cardstock, something unexpected stirred inside me. It wasn't anger, though I had every right to that emotion. It wasn't a desire for revenge, though the thought was tempting. It was something quieter and more powerful, a calm certainty that I deserved to walk into that ballroom with my head held high, to show Marcus and everyone who'd watched our marriage crumble that I hadn't just survived his rejection, but had thrived beyond his wildest imagination. I thought about my children, about the empire I'd built, about the woman I'd become in the ashes of my marriage. And I realized that attending Marcus's wedding wasn't about him at all. It was about me reclaiming my narrative, refusing to hide in shame from a past that no longer had power over me. So I RSVP'd, yes, my hand steady as I checked the box confirming my attendance, and I began to plan for a moment that would redefine everything Marcus thought he knew about me. I called my stylist, a talented woman named Zara, who'd helped me develop a personal style that reflected my success without screaming for attention. Together, we chose the emerald gown, a colour that complemented my skin tone and made a statement without being gaudy or desperate. The diamonds in my hair were real, purchased with my own money, each tiny stone a reminder that I'd earned everything I had through talent and determination. The limousine was Patricia's idea. She insisted that I arrive in style befitting a tech entrepreneur and self-made millionaire, not slinking in through the back door like someone who had something to be ashamed of. The hardest decision was whether to bring the children, my beautiful triplets who knew nothing of their father or the circumstances of their birth. I'd told them age-appropriate truths, that their daddy lived far away and didn't know about them, that sometimes adults made complicated choices that children didn't need to understand yet. But bringing them to Marcus's wedding felt like crossing a line, potentially traumatizing them, or using them as weapons in an adult conflict that wasn't their fault or their responsibility to resolve. In the end, it was Marcus's mother who made the decision for me. She'd reached out 2 weeks before the wedding, her voice trembling on the phone as she begged me to forgive her for not standing up for me during the divorce, for choosing her son's side when she knew in her heart that he was wrong. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I'd moved away and started over, and she wanted me to know that not a day passed when she didn't think about me, didn't wonder if I was okay, didn't regret the way things had ended. I'd cried during that phone call, not from pain but from the relief of knowing that at least one person from my old life saw me as more than Marcus's failed wife. When I told her about the triplets, about the pregnancy I'd hidden to protect my children from potential harm. She wept openly, asking if she could meet them, begging for a chance to be the grandmother she should have been from the beginning. I sent her photos first, then arranged a video call, and watched as this elegant woman I'd once called mother broke down at the sight of 3 beautiful faces that carried pieces of her family's legacy in their features. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? Have you ever had to face someone who hurt you deeply? I'd love to hear your thoughts. When Marcus's mother learned that I'd been invited to the wedding, she insisted that I bring the children, that they sit with her in the family section where they belonged, that Marcus face the consequences of his choices in the most undeniable way possible. She promised to protect them, to make sure the day didn't become traumatic or confusing, to shield them from any ugliness that might arise. And so I'd agreed, preparing my babies for what I framed as a fancy party where they'd meet their grandmother in person for the first time, where they'd wear beautiful clothes and see a big celebration. They were excited, completely innocent of the drama that swirled around them, thrilled at the prospect of riding in a limousine and wearing their special outfits. The morning of the wedding, I dressed them carefully, adjusting Michael's tiny bow tie, smoothing Maya's dress, making sure Matthew's shoes were tied properly, all while my own heart raced with anticipation and nerves. As our limousine pulled up to the grand hotel where Marcus's wedding was being held, I took a deep breath and squeezed my children's hands, drawing strength from their presence. The driver opened our door, and I stepped out first, then helped each child exit with grace and care. The hotel entrance was magnificent, all marble and gold, exactly the kind of ostentatious display that Marcus had always loved, a public declaration of his wealth and status. I could see guests arriving in their expensive cars, women in designer gowns, and men in tailored suits, the cream of society gathered to witness Marcus Wellington claim his new bride. For just a moment, my old insecurities tried to surface, whispering that I didn't belong here, that I was still that broken woman Marcus had discarded. But then Maya tugged my hand and said, "Mummy, you look like a princess." And I remembered who I really was. I was Rachel Thompson, self-made entrepreneur, devoted mother, survivor of storms that would have broken lesser souls. I was not here to beg for scraps or seek approval from people who'd never valued me. I was here to close a chapter, to face my past without flinching, to show my children through my actions that dignity and grace were always the right choice, even when others chose cruelty. Walking into that ballroom with my head held high was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Harder even than signing those divorce papers or giving birth to 3 babies in one terrifying night. Every eye in the room turned toward us, every conversation paused mid-sentence, and I could feel the weight of their judgment and curiosity pressing against my skin like a physical force. But I kept walking, kept my expression serene and confident, kept my children close as we made our way down that aisle toward Marcus's mother. I didn't look at Marcus, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing any emotion on my face beyond calm composure. I focused on his mother's tear-stained face, on the way she stood to receive us as if we were royalty, on the gasps of surprise that rippled through the crowd as the truth of who these children were became impossible to deny. When Marcus's mother embraced me, I felt 3 years of pain begin to release their grip on my heart. This woman who'd taught me to cook Marcus's favorite meals, who'd welcomed me into her family with open arms, who'd failed me when I needed her most but was trying to make amends now, held me like I was precious, irreplaceable, worthy of love. She knelt down to the children's level, introduced herself as their grandmother, and I watched my babies' faces light up with the innocent joy of meeting someone who clearly adored them. Marcus's mother had brought small gifts for each of them, carefully chosen toys that she pulled from her purse, and the children thanked her with the good manners I'd worked hard to instill. As we settled into our seats in the 3rd row, I finally allowed myself to glance toward the altar where Marcus stood frozen, his face a mask of shock, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Was it regret? Recognition? Fear? I didn't know, and I realized with some surprise that I didn't particularly care. This moment wasn't about Marcus's feelings or reactions. It was about me reclaiming space that had been stolen from me, about refusing to be erased or forgotten or diminished by someone else's narrative. The ceremony was supposed to begin at 3 o'clock, but it was now 3:15, and Marcus still hadn't signaled for the pastor to continue. The guests were growing restless, whispering behind their hands, pulling out phones to capture what was clearly becoming a spectacle rather than a solemn occasion. Vanessa, Marcus's bride-to-be, looked increasingly distressed, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run slightly as tears of frustration gathered in her eyes. I almost felt sorry for her, this young woman who'd believed she was marrying a successful, available man, who probably had no idea about the complexity of his past or the cruelty he was capable of inflicting. She tugged at his sleeve more insistently now, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom as she hissed at him to continue, to stop staring at me, to remember that this was their day, their moment, their future. But Marcus seemed incapable of movement, his eyes fixed on the children who sat swinging their legs and whispering to their grandmother, completely oblivious to the chaos they'd caused simply by existing. I could see his mind working, could almost watch him doing the math, counting backward from their age to the night he'd demanded a divorce, realizing that I'd been pregnant with his children when he'd called me broken and worthless. I wondered what he was feeling, if he was capable of genuine remorse, or if his distress was purely selfish, focused on what he'd lost rather than what he'd done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, Marcus seemed to shake himself out of his stupor. He turned to the pastor and nodded, signaling that the ceremony should continue, though his voice when he spoke his vows was hollow and mechanical, lacking any of the joy or conviction that should accompany such promises. I listened to him pledge his love and devotion to Vanessa, heard him promise to cherish and honor her through all the days of their lives, and I felt nothing but a distant pity for both of them. This marriage was starting under a cloud of shock and revelation, built on a foundation of secrets and half-truths that would likely crack under the weight of reality. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was scattered and uncertain, guests clearly unsure how to react to a ceremony that had been so thoroughly disrupted by an unexpected revelation. Marcus kissed his new bride with what looked like desperation rather than passion, as if he could erase the past 3 years and the 3 children sitting in the 3rd row through sheer force of will and public performance. The reception that followed the ceremony was held in an even larger ballroom, decorated with thousands of white roses and candles that must have cost more than most people's annual salary. I'd planned to stay only for the ceremony itself, to make my statement and then leave before things became more complicated or uncomfortable. But Marcus's mother begged me to stay for at least the dinner service, explaining that she'd arranged for us to sit at her table, that she wanted more time with her grandchildren, that she had so much to tell me and to hear about our lives. I agreed reluctantly, partly because I didn't want to disappoint this woman who'd been brave enough to reach out and apologize, partly because the triplets were having such a wonderful time, and I hated to cut their joy short. We were seated at a table near the front of the room, a position of honor that made it impossible for anyone to ignore our presence. I could feel eyes on us constantly, could hear the whispers growing louder as wine flowed and people's inhibitions loosened. Who was I? Where had I come from? Were those really Marcus's children? Why had no one known about them? The questions swirled around us like smoke, but I kept my head high, and my attention focused on my children and Marcus's mother. Dinner was an elaborate affair, course after course of gourmet food that the triplets picked at uncertainly, more accustomed to my simple home cooking than to truffle-infused sauces and exotic preparations. I helped them navigate the confusing array of silverware, whispered explanations of what each dish was, made sure they didn't feel overwhelmed or out of place in this formal setting. Marcus's mother told them stories about their father as a child, carefully edited versions that painted him in a positive light without mentioning his current failure to acknowledge their existence. I appreciated her discretion, her understanding that these children deserved to know their heritage without being burdened by adult conflicts and betrayals. Between courses, various guests approached our table, ostensibly to pay respects to Marcus's mother, but clearly fishing for information about me and the children. I answered their questions politely but vaguely, confirming nothing, explaining little, maintaining an air of mysterious composure that seemed to frustrate them, even as it increased their curiosity. I could see Marcus watching us from the head table where he sat with Vanessa, his new wife looking increasingly miserable as her husband's attention remained fixed elsewhere. About halfway through the reception, during the speeches and toasts portion of the evening, something unexpected happened that shifted the entire energy of the event. Marcus's business partner, a man named Gregory, who'd always been kind to me during my marriage, stood up to give a toast and went dramatically off script. He started by congratulating Marcus and Vanessa in the traditional way, wishing them happiness and prosperity. But then his tone changed, becoming more serious and pointed. Gregory spoke about the importance of integrity in business and in life, about how the measure of a person wasn't their wealth or status, but how they treated others, especially those who depended on them. He talked about responsibility and accountability, about facing the consequences of our choices with courage rather than hiding behind money and lawyers. As he spoke, his eyes kept drifting toward our table, toward the 3 children who sat there as living proof of Marcus's failures. The room grew uncomfortable, guests shifting in their seats and exchanging worried glances, unsure whether this was still a toast or had become something else entirely. Gregory concluded by saying that he hoped Marcus had learned from his past mistakes and would treat his new wife with the respect and devotion she deserved, a statement that earned scattered applause and visible anger from Marcus. The moment Gregory sat down, Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with wine and emotion, and I knew with sinking certainty that the fragile peace of the evening was about to shatter. He demanded to know who those children were, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire ballroom, despite his mother's urgent attempts to silence him. He pointed directly at Michael, Maya, and Matthew, asking if someone was going to explain why strange children were sitting at his mother's table at his wedding reception. The audacity of his question, the deliberate pretense that he didn't recognize his own children's features in their faces, sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the crowd. I felt my children press closer to me, confused and frightened by the angry man pointing at them, and something fierce and protective rose in my chest, like a lioness defending her cubs. I stood slowly, carefully, every eye in the room now fixed on me with rapt attention. When I spoke, my voice was clear and calm, carrying across the ballroom without shouting, every word chosen with deliberate precision to cut through Marcus's pretense and denial. I introduced myself as Rachel Thompson, formerly Rachel Wellington, Marcus's ex-wife of 3 years. I explained that these were Michael, Maya, and Matthew, triplets who would turn 3 years old in 2 months, children who had been conceived during our marriage and born after our divorce. I stated these facts without emotion, without accusation, simply laying out the truth in a way that made Marcus's ignorance impossible to maintain. I added that Marcus had never met these children because I had chosen not to inform him of their existence, a decision I'd made to protect them from potential harm or manipulation. The ballroom erupted in chaos, guests shouting questions, phones appearing to record the confrontation, Vanessa bursting into tears at the head table. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions, shock giving way to anger, giving way to something that might have been panic as he realized the implications of this revelation. His mother stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder in a gesture of support and solidarity. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of maternal authority that silenced even the loudest whispers. Marcus's mother addressed the room with the commanding presence of someone who'd spent decades navigating high society and corporate politics. She confirmed that I was telling the truth, that these were indeed her grandchildren, that she'd verified it through her own research and recent contact with me. She explained that she'd invited us to sit with her at the wedding because family belonged together, because these children deserved to know their heritage, and because she would not participate in erasing or hiding them to protect her son's reputation. Her words hung in the air like a benediction and a judgment, making it clear that she stood with me and the children against her own son if necessary. The look on Marcus's face was one I'd never seen before, a mixture of betrayal and realization that his mother, his staunchest ally, had chosen a different side in this conflict. Vanessa had stopped crying and was staring at Marcus with dawning horror, clearly processing what this revelation meant for their marriage, for their future, for the lies he must have told her about his past. I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for her, this young woman whose wedding day had become a nightmare through no fault of her own, who was learning difficult truths about her new husband in the most public way possible. Marcus finally found his voice, demanding to know why I'd never told him about the pregnancy, why I'd hidden his children from him for 3 years, what right I had to make such a decision unilaterally. His questions were valid on the surface, but they ignored the context of our divorce, the cruelty of his words, the finality of his rejection. I could have reminded him of how he'd called me broken and worthless, could have thrown his own words back in his face, but I chose a different path. I explained calmly that on the night he'd demanded a divorce, I had been prepared to tell him about the pregnancy, but his words and his certainty that I was the problem in our marriage had made me afraid of what he might do with that information. I told him that I'd chosen to protect my children from a father who might reject them or use them as pawns, that I'd built a life for them filled with love and security and peace. I acknowledged that perhaps my decision had been flawed, that perhaps he'd deserved to know regardless of his behavior, but I stood by my choice to prioritize my children's well-being over his right to know. The ballroom had gone completely silent, hundreds of people hanging on every word of this real-life drama playing out before them. Marcus's lawyers were probably already calculating the implications, the potential lawsuits, the custody battles that might emerge from this revelation. But in that moment, I didn't care about legal consequences or public opinion. I cared only about my children who were pressed against my legs seeking comfort, who didn't understand why the angry man was yelling at their mother. I knelt down to their level, told them everything was okay, that sometimes adults had disagreements, but it didn't mean anyone was in trouble. Maya asked if we could go home now, her little voice tired and overwhelmed, and I realized that this spectacle had gone on long enough. I stood, thanked Marcus's mother for her kindness and support, and began gathering our things to leave. But before I could take more than a step toward the exit, Marcus was there, blocking my path, his expression desperate and pleading in a way I'd never seen during our marriage. He asked me to wait, to please give him a chance to explain, to talk privately about the children and what happened next. I looked at this man who'd once been my whole world, who'd promised to love me in sickness and health and then abandoned me the moment I didn't meet his expectations. I saw not the powerful billionaire or the cruel husband, but a flawed human being who'd made terrible choices and was now facing consequences he'd never imagined. Part of me wanted to refuse, to walk away and deny him the conversation he'd denied me when he'd handed me divorce papers without warning. But another part of me, the part that had grown and evolved through years of struggle and triumph, recognized that my children deserved better than to grow up with a father-shaped hole in their lives if there was any chance of redemption. I agreed to meet with him the following day in a neutral location with his mother present to discuss how we might move forward in a way that prioritized the children's needs above our own hurt and anger. I made it clear that I expected nothing from him financially, that I'd built a successful life on my own and needed no rescue or support. I told him that any relationship he had with the children would be earned through consistent, loving behavior, not demanded as a right or bought with money. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face in a display of emotion I'd never witnessed during our 8 years of marriage. He reached out as if to touch the children, then pulled back, seeming to understand that he had no right to presume that level of familiarity. Instead, he knelt down to their height and introduced himself simply as Marcus, a friend of their grandmother's, someone who hoped to get to know them better if they were comfortable with that. The triplets, sweet and trusting as children are, responded politely, but without particular interest, more focused on the fact that they were tired and ready to go home to their familiar beds and routines. I took their hands and walked toward the exit, Marcus's mother accompanying us, leaving behind a ballroom full of shocked guests and one very confused bride. As we stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For 3 years, I'd carried the secret of my children's paternity, had built walls around that information to protect us all. Now the truth was out, messy and public and impossible to ignore, and somehow I felt freer than I had in years. The following day, I met Marcus and his mother at a quiet cafe far from the social circles where we might be recognized or interrupted. I'd left the children with Patricia, my business partner and trusted friend, explaining that I had some adult business to handle and would be home by afternoon. Walking into that cafe felt surreal, like stepping back in time to early days of our relationship when we used to meet for coffee and talk for hours about our dreams and plans, but the man sitting across from me now was a stranger in many ways, older and worn around the edges, carrying regrets that showed in the lines around his eyes. His mother sat between us like a mediator, her presence a reminder that this meeting was about moving forward, not rehashing the past. Marcus started by apologizing, a lengthy speech about how wrong he'd been, how he'd let fear and pride poison his judgment, how he'd destroyed the best thing in his life because he couldn't handle feeling like a failure. He explained that the fertility issues had made him question his own worth, had triggered insecurities he'd never acknowledged or addressed, and he'd lashed out at me rather than face his own pain. His apology was genuine as far as I could tell, but it didn't erase the years of hurt or make me trust him with my children's hearts. I listened without interrupting, letting him say what he needed to say, but when he finished, I was clear about my expectations. I told him that if he wanted to be part of the children's lives, it had to be for them, not to ease his guilt or repair his reputation. I explained that children needed consistency and reliability, that he couldn't drift in and out of their lives when it was convenient or public opinion demanded it. I laid out terms that my lawyer would formalize supervised visitation at first, building slowly toward more time if the children were comfortable and he proved himself trustworthy. I made it clear that I would not tolerate any attempts to use his wealth or influence to undermine my parenting or take custody of the children. I told him that the moment he caused them pain or confusion, he would be cut off completely regardless of what any court might say. Marcus agreed to everything without argument, his eagerness almost desperate, and I wondered if he truly understood what he was committing to, or if he was simply trying to fill the emptiness that had clearly taken root in his life. If you're still watching, I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done in Rachel's situation? Would you have let Marcus back into your life, or kept the children away from him? Your perspective matters to me, so please share your thoughts. And if this story is touching your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss how everything turns out. Over the following months, Marcus slowly, carefully built a relationship with Michael, Maya, and Matthew. He started with short visits at my house, playing simple games and reading books while I stayed in the room, observing his interactions and making sure the children felt safe. He brought thoughtful gifts that weren't extravagant, toys that encouraged creativity rather than expensive gadgets that would have been inappropriate for their age. He asked questions about their routines and preferences, trying to learn who they were rather than imposing his own ideas of who they should be. Gradually, the children warmed to him, though they still called him Marcus rather than Dad, a distinction I didn't force them to change. Maya was the first to fully accept him, climbing into his lap during story time and asking him to do funny voices for different characters. Michael remained more reserved, watching Marcus with analytical eyes that seemed far too old for a 3-year-old, as if he was trying to figure out whether this man could be trusted with his mother's heart. Matthew fell somewhere in between, friendly but not attached, happy to play but not devastated when visits ended. I watched these interactions with mixed emotions, grateful that my children were getting a chance to know their father but guarded against the possibility of future hurt. Marcus's mother became a regular presence in our lives as well, visiting weekly and showering the children with the kind of grandmotherly love I'd hoped they would have. She taught Maya to bake cookies, took Michael to the aquarium to feed his fascination with ocean creatures, helped Matthew build elaborate block towers that defied physics. Her relationship with the children was uncomplicated by the baggage between Marcus and me, pure in a way that brought tears to my eyes when I watched them together. She apologized to me repeatedly for not standing up during the divorce, for choosing loyalty to her son over justice for me, and I forgave her because holding on to that anger served no purpose, and she was genuinely trying to make amends. 6 months after the wedding confrontation, Marcus showed up at my door, unannounced, his face pale and his hands shaking. I invited him in reluctantly, worried that some emergency had occurred, my mind immediately going to worst-case scenarios. He sat down heavily on my couch and told me that he'd filed for divorce from Vanessa, that their marriage had been doomed from the start by lies and secrets and his inability to stop thinking about what he'd lost. I felt sympathy for Vanessa, who'd done nothing wrong except marry a man who wasn't emotionally available, whose heart was stuck in the past. Marcus said he wasn't telling me this to win me back or suggest we try again. He knew that ship had sailed and he'd been the one to sink it. He just wanted me to know that he was trying to become a better person, that therapy was helping him understand the fears and insecurities that had driven his cruelty, that he wanted to be the kind of father and man his children could be proud of someday. I appreciated Marcus's honesty about his divorce and his therapeutic journey, but I made it clear that his personal life was separate from his relationship with the children. What mattered to me was not whether he was married or single, happy or struggling, but whether he showed up consistently for Michael, Maya, and Matthew with love and patience. Over time, Marcus proved that he could be that person, at least in small doses and with clear boundaries. He never missed a scheduled visit, never made promises to the children he couldn't keep, never tried to buy their affection with extravagant gifts or experiences. He volunteered to handle bedtime routines when I needed a break, learning how Maya liked her blankets arranged just so, how Michael needed 3 stories instead of 1, how Matthew required a nightlight shaped like a turtle. These small acts of attentive parenting told me more about his growth than any grand gesture could have. I began to relax my guard slightly, to trust that perhaps Marcus had genuinely changed, that perhaps the children could have a father who added value to their lives rather than complication and pain. My own life continued to flourish in ways I'd never imagined during those dark days after the divorce. Patricia and I launched a second company, a consulting firm that helped other startups develop authentic brand identities that resonated with diverse audiences. The work was fulfilling and profitable, allowing me to build wealth while also making a meaningful impact on entrepreneurs who reminded me of my younger self. I bought a beautiful house overlooking the ocean, with enough bedrooms for each child to have their own space and a yard where they could play safely. I hired a wonderful nanny named Grace who helped with childcare when I travelled for business, a warm Jamaican woman who sang to the children and taught them about her culture. I dated occasionally, meeting men through friends and professional connections, but I was careful not to introduce anyone to the children unless a relationship became serious. None of them did, not because the men weren't good people, but because I'd grown to value my independence and peace too much to settle for anything less than extraordinary love. One afternoon, about a year after the wedding confrontation, Marcus asked if he could take the children to meet his extended family at a reunion being held at his mother's estate. I hesitated, worried about exposing them to people who might judge or reject them because of the circumstances of their birth. But Marcus assured me that his mother had prepared the family, that everyone knew about the children and wanted to welcome them, that anyone who couldn't be kind would not be invited. I agreed on the condition that I would accompany them, that I wouldn't leave my children in an environment where I couldn't protect them, if necessary. The reunion was larger than I'd expected. Dozens of Marcus's relatives gathered under white tents on manicured lawns, children running through sprinklers while adults sipped wine and reminisced. I was prepared for awkwardness or hostility, for whispers and judgment, but instead I was greeted with warmth and genuine curiosity. Marcus's aunts and uncles asked about my business, complimented my dress, treated me like an honoured guest rather than a scandal to be managed. The children were embraced immediately, swept up in games with their cousins, showered with attention from relatives who'd been denied access to them for years. I watched Maya ride a pony led by Marcus's cousin, saw Michael engaged in serious conversation with an elderly uncle who shared his love of marine life, noticed Matthew teaching a group of younger children how to build the perfect sandcastle. For the first time since learning about the pregnancy, I saw my children as part of something bigger than just our small family unit, connected to a history and heritage that enriched their sense of identity. Marcus stayed close to me throughout the afternoon, not possessive or presumptuous, but simply present, pointing out relatives and sharing family stories that helped me understand the context of his upbringing. His mother found me as the sun was setting, pulling me aside for a private conversation that I'd been half expecting and half dreading. She told me that watching Marcus with the children had shown her a side of her son she'd feared was lost forever, a capacity for selfless love and genuine care that his first marriage had never brought out. She said that she knew Marcus's mistakes couldn't be undone and shouldn't be forgotten, but she hoped that I could see he was trying to become worthy of the second chance I'd given him. I told her honestly that I saw his efforts and appreciated them, that the children were benefiting from having their father in their lives in this limited, structured way. But I also made it clear that I had no intention of rekindling a romantic relationship with Marcus, that too much had been broken between us to rebuild that kind of trust and intimacy. She nodded understanding, saying she wasn't asking me to forgive or forget, just to keep an open heart to whatever possibilities the future might hold. As we drove home that evening, the children chattering excitedly in the back seat about their new cousins and the fun they'd had, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. This wasn't the family I'd imagined when I'd married Marcus all those years ago, but it was a family nonetheless. Imperfect and unconventional, but filled with love and possibility. I'd survived my worst nightmare and built something beautiful from the wreckage, and that accomplishment belonged to me alone, untouchable by anyone else's opinion or validation. The children's 4th birthday arrived with all the chaos and joy that milestone brought. I threw them a party at our house, inviting their preschool friends and the handful of adult friends I'd made in our coastal town. Marcus asked if he could attend, and I agreed, curious to see how he'd navigate being one parent among many rather than the center of attention. He showed up early to help set up, hanging decorations and arranging tables without being asked, chatting easily with my friends who'd heard enough about our history to be wary but were willing to give him a chance for the children's sake. When the kids arrived, Marcus helped organize games and hand out party favors, comfortable in his role as helper rather than host. I noticed him watching me several times throughout the afternoon, his expressions soft and wistful, but he never crossed any boundaries or made me uncomfortable with unwanted attention. The highlight of the party was when we brought out 3 small cakes, one for each child decorated according to their individual interests. Ocean creatures for Michael, princesses for Maya, dinosaurs for Matthew. Watching my babies blow out their candles, their faces glowing with happiness and anticipation, I felt tears prick my eyes. 4 years ago, I'd been alone and terrified, uncertain how I'd manage to raise 3 babies on my own. Now here we were, thriving and happy, surrounded by people who loved us, celebrating in a home I'd bought with money I'd earned through my own talent and hard work. Marcus caught my eye across the table and mouthed, "Thank you," whether for the party or for the chance to be there, or for something else entirely, I wasn't sure. But I nodded acknowledgement, recognizing that we'd both grown and changed in ways we never could have predicted. After the guests left and the children were asleep, exhausted from excitement and sugar, Marcus helped me clean up the considerable mess left by 24 4-year-olds. We worked in comfortable silence, gathering paper plates and deflating balloons, and it struck me how different this felt from the cold distance that had characterized the end of our marriage. We'd become something like friends, or at least cooperative co-parents, able to exist in the same space without hostility or awkwardness. As Marcus was leaving, he hesitated at the door, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. I waited patiently, giving him space to find his words. He told me that seeing me thrive, watching me build a successful business and raise amazing children and create a beautiful life, had taught him more about strength and grace than anything else in his life. He said that his biggest regret wasn't just losing me, but failing to appreciate what he'd had when he had it, taking for granted a woman who'd loved him unconditionally and supported him without reservation. He acknowledged that he'd been cruel and cowardly, that he'd projected his own insecurities onto me rather than dealing with them honestly, that I deserved so much better than he'd given me. His apology was more comprehensive and thoughtful than any he'd offered before, showing real understanding of how his actions had affected me rather than just general regret. I thanked him for his words, told him that I'd forgiven him not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting, and I needed that energy for building my life rather than nursing old wounds. I explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending the past hadn't happened, but it did mean releasing the hold that past had on my present and future. I told him that I was genuinely glad he was growing and changing, becoming a better father and person, and that I hoped he'd continue that journey for his own sake, as well as for the children. We said goodnight with a hug that felt both strange and natural, closing a chapter while leaving doors open to whatever came next. That night, lying in bed listening to the ocean waves through my open window, I reflected on how far I'd travelled from that budget motel room where I'd cried myself to sleep while pregnant and alone. I'd gone through fire and emerged not just unburned, but forged into something stronger and more valuable than I'd been before. The next few years passed in a blur of school activities, business growth, and the everyday magic of watching children develop into their own unique people. Michael's fascination with ocean life deepened into a genuine scientific curiosity that had him reading marine biology books meant for much older children. Maya discovered a talent for dance, her natural grace and rhythm making her a standout in her ballet classes. Matthew developed an unexpected gift for storytelling, spinning elaborate tales that kept his siblings and me entertained for hours. I enrolled them in activities that nurtured their individual interests, while also making sure they spent plenty of time just being kids, playing in the yard, building forts, getting dirty in the garden. Marcus remained a consistent presence in their lives, graduating from supervised visits to unsupervised time as he proved himself trustworthy. The children started calling him Dad around their 5th birthday, a shift that happened naturally without any prompting from me or insistence from him, and I could see how much that simple word meant to him every time they said it. My business continued to expand, Bridgeworks having grown into a platform used by millions worldwide, and my consulting firm developing a reputation for excellence that brought prestigious clients to our door. I was invited to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship and resilience, to share my story of building success from the ashes of personal tragedy. These speaking engagements were initially terrifying, requiring me to be vulnerable about my divorce and single motherhood in front of hundreds of strangers. But they became powerful opportunities to inspire others who were facing their own struggles. I heard from countless women who'd been told they were worthless or broken, who'd survived divorce or betrayal or loss, and were trying to rebuild their lives. Their messages and stories reminded me that my experience, painful as it had been, could serve a purpose beyond my own healing, could light a path for others walking through similar darkness. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly women and people from underrepresented communities, offering guidance and connections that helped them avoid some of the mistakes I'd made and capitalize on opportunities I'd learned to recognize. One of my mentees was a young woman named Simone, who reminded me so much of my younger self that it was almost eerie. She'd recently divorced, had 2 small children, and was trying to launch a tech startup with almost no capital and a lot of determination. I invested in her company and took her under my wing, teaching her everything I'd learned about building a business while managing the demands of single parenthood. Watching Simone grow in confidence and skill, seeing her company begin to gain traction, felt like closing a circle, transforming my pain into purpose that extended beyond my own story. Marcus noticed the changes in me, commented that I seemed more at peace than he'd ever seen me, more settled into my own skin, and certain of my worth. He was right, I realized. Somewhere along the journey from broken divorcee to successful entrepreneur to mentor and philanthropist, I'd stopped seeking external validation and learned to trust my own judgment and value my own contributions. The children were 7 years old when Marcus asked if we could have a serious conversation about our future. My first instinct was defensiveness, assuming he was going to suggest we try to rebuild our romantic relationship, a proposition I had no interest in entertaining. But what he actually wanted to discuss surprised me completely. He explained that his mother's health was declining, that she'd been diagnosed with a progressive condition that would require increasing care, and he wanted to move her into his home rather than putting her in a facility. The problem was that his house, the same mansion we'd shared during our marriage, felt cold and empty, unsuitable for someone who needed warmth and family around her during her final years. He asked if I would consider allowing his mother to spend significant time at our house, where she could be surrounded by the children she adored and the daughter-in-law she'd never stopped considering family. The request was unusual and complicated, requiring me to open my home and life to someone who, despite our positive relationship now, was still connected to painful memories and difficult history. I told Marcus I needed time to think about it, to discuss it with the children and consider the practical implications. That night, I talked to Michael, Maya, and Matthew about their grandmother's illness, explaining in age-appropriate terms that she was sick and needed extra love and care. Their response was immediate and unanimous. They wanted Grandma to stay with us as much as possible, to have her own room where she could keep her things, to be part of our daily lives. Their certainty made my decision easier. And the next day, I told Marcus we would welcome his mother into our home for as long as she needed us. We converted my home office into a comfortable suite for her, installing safety features and medical equipment, hiring nurses to provide professional care while I focused on emotional support and family time. Marcus's mother moved in on a sunny Tuesday, tears streaming down her face as she thanked me for this kindness that she didn't deserve. I told her that family takes care of family, that she'd shown up for me when it mattered, and I would do the same for her. Having Marcus's mother in our home changed our family dynamics in unexpected ways. She became the anchor of our household, the person the children came to after school to share their day, the keeper of family stories and traditions that connected them to their heritage. Marcus visited almost daily to check on his mother, which meant we saw each other far more frequently than our custody arrangement required. At first, this increased contact was awkward, both of us hyper-aware of crossing boundaries or giving wrong impressions. But gradually we fell into a rhythm that felt natural, co-parenting and caregiving together in ways we'd never managed during our marriage. I saw Marcus at his best during this time, patient with his mother's declining abilities, gentle when she became confused or frustrated, present in ways he'd never been during our marriage. I realized that grief and the prospect of loss had opened something in him that success and comfort had kept closed. A capacity for genuine vulnerability and emotional connection. 6 months after his mother moved in, she called me to her room for a private conversation, her voice weak, but her mind still sharp. She told me that watching Marcus and me co-parent and care for her had shown her what our marriage could have been if Marcus had been mature enough to appreciate what he had. She said she could see that we'd both grown into better versions of ourselves, that perhaps all the pain and separation had been necessary for us to become people who could actually build something healthy together. But she also acknowledged that the past couldn't be undone, that some broken things stayed broken no matter how much we wished otherwise, and she wasn't suggesting we owed it to anyone to try again. What she wanted was to know that I'd truly forgiven Marcus, that I didn't carry bitterness in my heart that would poison my future, because she couldn't rest easy if she thought her son's mistakes had permanently damaged my ability to trust and love. I assured her honestly that I'd forgiven Marcus completely, that I wished him well and hoped he found genuine happiness, and that my heart was open to love even if that love wouldn't be with him. She seemed satisfied with my answer, settling back into her pillows with a peaceful expression. And I realized this conversation had been important to her, a loose end she needed to tie before letting go. Marcus's mother passed away peacefully 3 weeks later, surrounded by her family, her hand held by grandchildren who adored her, and a son who'd finally learned what really mattered in life. The funeral was a grand affair, befitting a woman of her social standing, but the moments that mattered most were small and intimate, the triplets placing flowers on her casket, Marcus breaking down in my arms, our family grieving together the loss of someone who'd loved us all, despite our complications. In the weeks following the funeral, Marcus seemed lost, wandering through his life without the anchor his mother had provided. He'd taken a leave of absence from work, something I'd never imagined him doing, to process his grief and reevaluate his priorities. One evening, he showed up at my door looking exhausted and vulnerable, asking if we could talk not about the children or logistics, but about us, about what we'd become and what we might be. I invited him in, made tea, and we sat in the living room where we'd spent so many evenings caring for his mother. Marcus told me that losing his mother had made him realize how much time he'd wasted on things that didn't matter, chasing success and status while neglecting relationships and connection. He said that the past few years of co-parenting and friendship with me had been the happiest of his adult life, not because of any romantic element, but because I'd taught him through example what it meant to live with integrity and purpose. He wasn't asking me to take him back, he clarified, wasn't presuming that I owed him anything, or that we could erase the past and start over. But he wanted me to know that if I ever decided I was open to building something new, not a recreation of our failed marriage, but a completely different relationship between two people who'd grown and changed, he would be honored and grateful for that opportunity. His words were thoughtful and humble, free of the entitlement and arrogance that had characterized our marriage, and I found myself genuinely considering what he was proposing. I told Marcus honestly that I didn't know what I wanted, that I'd built a good life alone and wasn't sure I needed or wanted a partner to complete it. But I also admitted that our friendship over the past few years had been meaningful to me, that I'd enjoyed having him as a co-parent and companion, that perhaps there was potential for something more if we were both willing to take it slowly and honestly. We agreed to start dating, actually dating like two people getting to know each other, with no assumptions about where it would lead or pressure to make it work for the children's sake. We went to dinner at restaurants where we'd never been together, saw movies, took walks on the beach while the children were in school, talked about our hopes and fears with a vulnerability we'd never achieved during our marriage. I discovered that I genuinely liked this version of Marcus, respected his growth and admired his commitment to being better, but I also remained cautious, aware that people could backslide and old patterns could reassert themselves under stress. For 6 months, we dated while maintaining separate households and clear boundaries, not introducing any romantic element into our parenting relationship. The children noticed the change, asked questions about whether Mommy and Daddy were getting back together, and I was honest with them that we were figuring things out, that adult relationships were complicated, and we wanted to make sure any decisions we made were good for everyone. As our relationship deepened, I found myself falling in love again, not with the memory of who Marcus had been, but with the reality of who he'd become, someone capable of admitting mistakes, doing hard work to change, showing up consistently with humility and care. The moment I knew for certain came on an ordinary Tuesday, watching Marcus help Matthew with homework, while Michael showed him a new fish he'd drawn, and Maya practiced her latest dance routine in the background. This was family, messy and imperfect, but filled with love and presence. And I realized that holding on to the past out of fear was preventing me from fully embracing the present. That night, after the children were asleep, I told Marcus that I was ready to try building something real together. Not a resurrection of our failed marriage, but a completely new relationship built on the foundation of everything we'd learned and survived. He cried, actually cried tears of joy and relief, and told me that he would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of this second chance, that he would never take for granted the gift I was giving him. We took it slowly, me moving into his house, the one we'd once shared but that felt completely different now, redecorated and reimagined as a space for our blended, complicated, beautiful family. We got married again 2 years later, a small ceremony on the beach with just the children and a handful of close friends exchanging vows we'd written ourselves that acknowledged our past mistakes and promised to do better, to choose love and honesty and growth, even when it was hard. The children were the flower girls and ring bearers, dressed in white and beaming with joy that their family was complete in a new way. Standing there with Marcus, saying promises that felt real and earned rather than naive and hopeful, I realized that sometimes the best love stories aren't the ones that start perfectly, but the ones that survive imperfectly, that break and rebuild into something stronger than they were before. This was our second beginning, hard-won and precious, and I was grateful for every painful step that had brought us here. As we kissed and the children cheered, I thought about that woman who'd walked into Marcus's wedding 3 years ago, broken, but pretending to be whole. And I wished I could tell her that everything would be okay, that the pain would pass and joy would return, that she was stronger than she knew and loved beyond measure. I was that woman and so much more, transformed by fire into gold.